Brilliant. I wish we could carry on, but we have less than half an hour, and I know that people want to come into the discussion as well. So let's get a few questions and comments from the audience. Please introduce yourself. If you have any affiliation, mention that. Try to be brief so we can take as many questions and comments as possible. I'll start with the audience in the room, then I'll go to the online audience. You can put questions through the chat or the Twitter feed. Who wants to start? Tom at the back. Can I have microphones, please? Over there. Yes. Okay. And I'll take a few in a row, and we'll try and do a couple of rounds.
Tom Newby from Care International. First, I'd just like to say that I really like Taman's point of framing this as humanist, as humanitarian versus to humanist rather than development. I think that is something that's very much worth exploring. And I think along the theme of what you were just saying, we look at Jordan, where there's the Jordan Compact, and there are 50,000 work permits per year, which haven't quite all been issued, and also Uganda, where there's now a huge influx, and there's a very enlightened refugee regime in Uganda, but with that huge influx, even that's coming under strain. So the question is whether this approach with livelihoods and jobs, which I fully support in principle as something to aim for, can ever reach the scale that we need it to reach. When we, in Jordan, we've got 50,000 work permits in a country where we've got best part of 1 million refugees. And so really the point is actually, can we reach that scale? How might we do that? What if we can't do that? And do we need to accept actually that when pursuing this and other approaches, that we do need to have that long-term welfare and safety net in place, because without that, it's just an unrealistic approach. So I'd like to hear thoughts on that.
Yeah, very good, thank you. Gentleman here at the front.
Hi, my name's Thomas Tishar. I'm a food security and livelihoods advisor with Save the Children. So I suppose my takeaway from listening to all four of you in different ways is that you're probably ahead of the curve, and the key constraints outside of your own abilities and resources is to change government mindsets. So albeit there's realistic constraints in poorer countries that are receiving refugees, as Tamam mentioned, but outside of that, it's about how do you change policy and attitudes towards the way they perceive displaced peoples and refugees. Because ultimately, unlike the gentleman said from Care, that's what's going to change opportunities for those people in the longer term. So I'd be curious to hear from any of the four of you sort of positive deviations in behavioral attitudes or policy from government spokespeople that you speak to or engage with, as well as the type of advocacy you try and make with them. Where do you see the highest priorities in changes of policy?
Thank you. The lady at the back there.
Thank you. My name's Juliet Webster. I'm with an organisation or rather a community group called De Beauvoir Welcomes Refugees, which is a small community group in London, bringing a Syrian family into our area quite soon. And my question really concerns this sort of theme that I think has been very valuable in this discussion, which is about blending refugees into their new contexts as much as possible, and creating opportunities for self-reliance and empowerment, all of which strikes an absolutely correct note as far as I can see. But there's a tension, at least in our neighbourhood, which I just wanted to flag up and see if anyone had any thoughts about, and that is the existing community of people, many of whom are very lacking in incomes, resources. We have quite poor neighbourhoods in East London where I live and where we're bringing a family in, and we think we are going to have to manage a tension, at least in our public discourse, about bringing a new family in and siting them within or alongside a fairly deprived community. And I just wonder if any of you have any thoughts about how that can be managed delicately.
Thank you, very valuable. And I'll take these two at the front, and then I'll come from another round. I can do three. Be brief, and then I want to try and fit another round in. Please.
Yes, my name is Nuha Altine. I'm from the Arab Urban Development Institute. Thank you for your excellent inputs. I just do have some points, maybe starting with regarding the element that you've mentioned about the different how the different refugees actually have different capacities or resilience to once they move into the camps. Don't you see that we need to shift from, I would say, social or economic resilience into physical resilience? Because again, the livelihoods that are built, when it's actually exposed to risks, because most of those refugees are their camps or the places where they are hosting within the city itself will be disaster-prone areas and places that are flooded or cyclone-prone places. So physical resilience, can't we really look into transforming that aid from the humanitarian aid agencies from food and shelter into how the buildings look like, where is it located, and how is it going to be stable, and also data, sharing data between the different agencies, because when it comes into human losses, I think the Sendai framework, the SDGs have emphasized a lot on the loss of data and how are we going to exchange this between the different agencies. Thank you.
Thank you. If you pass the microphone to the back.
Yeah, Abdi Mose from Friends of the Home Foundation. Being refugee myself in Kenya, fled from Somalia in 1991. I know what the experience is like, and thank you very much, and I'm very, very proud to be here today. Now, I just want to ask you and say it, what is the latest situation in the Dab refugee camp? Are they actually closing it? If yes, where are these people going back to? As we know what is happening in Mogadishu and Somalia every day. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And finally, the lady here at the front. I'll come for another one.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra Barrantes from the Development Pathways. I'm a senior policy specialist there. I wanted to ask a question both to Ziad and I suppose also Veronique in terms of their experience, because you mentioned, Ziad, something about need for refugees having poverty scales or classifications for poverty and different levels of poverty. And Veronique also mentioned the issue of how, depending on first arrivals and then 10 years back, there might be different in terms of assets and vulnerabilities. So I wanted to know the experience in terms of doing that kind of assessment in field. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want to start with that?
Start with the last question?
No, we'll take more, but I think let's take these ones and then try and fit in another quick round. Yeah. I think there is plenty more questions.
Yeah.
Now. To make sure.
Thank you so much. They're very interesting. And I try to be brief to let everybody talk. But I think, can we scale up on the livelihoods? That's an issue. And I think it's very interesting to see the Uganda model and how it's reacting to a very large movement of refugees. Uganda being one of those countries that everybody has been talking about, how, they have a great refugee policy framework. They're intentionally trying to integrate refugee, to support social integration, to support economic integration and all of this. And yet now with hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese coming in, this is crumbling. And I think it's not about doing one or the other. I think it's about understanding the situation, but not preconceiving livelihoods as being an afterthought, as being the next step, but understanding that refugees will work from day one, maybe not from day one, but they will work quite quickly as they're moved. But also, you're right, and I think it's not just about, livelihood as an opposition to long-term welfare and safety net. It's about having the two together and not thinking about it as being, we first assist and then their self-reliance, but understanding that, like with everybody else, this will be, people will come in and out of needing a safety net and not. And I think that is very important. And if you look at the executive summary, we've developed 9 principles of what we think are important to integrate in a long-term livelihood strategy. And one of them is a social safety net and understanding how that can be integrated to any kind of livelihood strategy. What changes the government policy? Well, first I want to say, yes, the national policy framework is one of the most, if not the most significant factor and element that will shape refugee livelihoods. It shapes not only what refugees are allowed to do or not and whether they're allowed to work or not, but it also shapes what organizations and aid agencies are allowed to do or not. But I think two things I would mention here. One is to understand how lower level governments interpret this policy framework and implement it. And there's been some great work around the role of municipalities in the Syrian refugee crisis, and I think this is very, very interesting. The second, while I can be quite critical of the Jordan Compact, and if you want to look online, we have one of the case studies that talks about some of the critique of the Jordan Compact. I think one of the things that we learned from the Jordan Compact is if you have the right donor incentives using trade and diplomacy and political will, you can shift government policy, and I think that's important to take this forward. I don't think the Jordan Compact was quite there. I think we need to be quite critical of how we should reuse that model, but it shows that when there's a political will between diplomacy and trade and financing and funding, we can shift things, and I think that we need to take forward. And the last thing I will say, and I'm sorry I may not answer all the questions, but also that in integrating the perspective of refugees, we need to understand how refugees themselves experience the national framework. It was very interesting in Malaysia, that has a very restrictive refugee policy, especially for Rohingya refugees, that are not even recognized, they have less of a status even as illegal migrants, if you want, that they are finding ways to work. They are finding ways to sustain themselves. And from this very restrictive policy that aid agencies endorse in Malaysia and therefore say we cannot do any livelihood support for refugees, we actually found refugees that told us, well, it's more of an unwritten turning a blind eye policy, and we are able to find opportunities to work. So understanding how their strategies to manage that landscape, what they do is very critical to then supporting their livelihoods, rather than having this stagnant, formal understanding of the policy framework.
Thanks. Yeah, there were a couple of questions directed to you, and I think one in particular asking about these positive deviations from Thomas. Where are we seeing these positive examples, or where is the UNHCR being most effective in this advocacy? And perhaps also, MSF and Lorna can reflect on that and other questions.
I will try to answer
Yes,
some
ma'am,
of the other questions also. Yeah, so on the question related to Jordan Compact and the 50,000 work permits and what happened after that, it failed, it didn't fail. Actually, refugees were offered some jobs that they didn't accept because the jobs were not relevant to what they want, and so there is a whole
as well, and it was easy to get there.
There's a whole experience in what's happening in Jordan Compact, but we need to look at it from the angle of learning, because what used to happen before Jordan Compact and before the Syria crisis, what used to happen, refugees flee, they are locked in a camp or even in urban settings. No discussions around livelihoods happen. This was the status quo. Humanitarian organizations come in and start organizing vocational training after vocational training. I'm sure those who work in humanitarian organizations know very much what I'm saying, because I was part of it. We are, so the critic is not for a specific organization, it's for the community. So vocational training after vocational training for years and years, to the extent that we graduate thousands of haircutters and thousands of tailors, and we distribute sewing machines, and we distribute chicken. So this was the model. Now there is an acknowledgement that this is not working. And I hope everybody acknowledged that, because I'm not sure yet. But so we need to do market-oriented. We need to look at the markets. We need to look at the economy. We need to Global Compact was a learning. Whether it's working or not, it should not be pointing fingers, because those who tried to make Jordan Compact work, they were having a theory that we come to the government of Jordan with an incentive. So donors and private sector and the international community will inject money in the country in a condition that the labor market will be open for refugees. It was a deal. So the deal theory has a good intention. Then whether it works or not, there are a lot of details, and I think everybody is learning, including governments, international community, and everyone is learning. So this is how I look at the Jordan Compact. Reaching scale, definitely it's not going to happen in the vocational training model. So we know that. We were reaching scale. Our indicator for success was number of people trained. And this means nothing. It means nothing, actually. So the scale in terms of really economic inclusion, whether it could be reached or not, it's a question that is not answered yet. And this is what we are trying to do. The Jordan Compact was like a hope. Yeah, and everybody was looking at Jordan Compact as a hope. But I think the CRRF and the Global Compact now is another opportunity to test the approach of economic inclusion and the scale of it. And the work with the World Bank, actually, that we are doing also, is one of the areas that could be promising, because the World Bank works on macroeconomy. And the World Bank can work with governments in order to provide financial support to specific sectors that can absorb refugees. And this is where the scale could be reached. So I partially answered the question about changing policies. In my opinion, changing policies could be done in two different levels. Advocacy, definitely, but it could be done in the type of New York Declaration thing, the Global Compact, the General Assembly. So this type of diplomacy. And you have the other type, which is the incentive-based advocacy. And this takes me to the question about tension between refugees and host communities. I want to give an example of a company without mentioning names, because I'm going to be fired if I mention the name. But the company who committed publicly to hire big number of refugees. And then the next day, they started facing boycott. And they came to us and they said, have you witnessed something like that before? Now we are willing to do good, and now we have a boycott campaign against us. And this is going to happen always, because you cannot eliminate xenophobia from the world. You can reduce it, but it's going to always be there. And you see the political situation in the world now. I'm not sure that we are going towards more inclusive and more tolerant world. We should work for it. So in order to avoid these issues, I think any program targeting refugees should not be labeled like that. The programs should be inclusive. So to solve the problem of exclusion for refugees, we should not be exclusive. We should be inclusive. So I think always, if you want to do poverty alleviation, it should be area-based. And this is what we are now discussing with some technical partners. So area-based approaches. So you work on poverty in neighborhood X. You chose neighborhood X because you know that a lot of refugees are living there and you want to do something for them. But you work with everybody, with the poor in this neighborhood. So this is the approach. Do we have like great success stories that prove that this works? I'm not sure yet. But I think theoretically this is how we should move to do the thing. And finally, on the poverty analysis, this is a new area also that started after Syria crisis, to be fair. Again, the humanitarian organization used to use a lot the vulnerability language, and we used to have like a traditional list of vulnerability. Also, those who used to work in humanitarian organizations know what I mean. Single mother, disabled people. So it's a status-based vulnerability. And all the assistance programs, all the development programs that we used to be implemented by humanitarian organizations used to use this vulnerability scale. The poverty analysis area started actually with the Syria crisis, where the World Bank jumped in and helped in Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt to do a different type, which is more multidimensional, to take into consideration vulnerability, but also econometrics and poverty. This is where in Lebanon, for example, they did the VASIR, and after that they used the proxy means testing, and then now they are doing the desk formula. It's all about econometrics and vulnerability. It's new, but The problem, it's like other things, how to reach scale. How can we assess the 65 million people in the world who are refugees in a poverty lens? We managed to assess poverty in a couple of countries, but it's not everywhere. In Malawi, in South Sudan, in Khartoum, in all these operations, are we using poverty analysis? Not yet. Maybe I gave the example of Malawi. Actually, we just finished a poverty analysis now in Malawi, which was not expected.
Is Tadab closing, yes or no? Just one word?
Yeah, so this question...
One word, yes or no?
Yeah, I can't give yes or no.
Right.
I can't.
Then we'll have a conversation
because
afterwards.
honestly, I don't know, but I can offline be in touch with you and give you what I can get from the office information.
Yeah. So I know there are a lot more questions. So Tamam and Lorna, hold your answers to this round. Then I'll come to you to start with the last round. Indulge me. We'll go over for 10 minutes, but then we give an opportunity. I see a lot of colleagues who are desperate to come in, and of course those who need to leave, feel free. There is wine for those who drink out there afterwards.
Nick has an answer for the DAB.
Oh right, okay, perfect.
Sorry, so I'm based in Kenya. The DAB so my name's Nick Wasuna, I'm with UNICEF. So in February, the Kenyan court ruled that it is unlawful to close the DAB. So that's where we are.
Perfect. Excellent. And again, you can chat afterwards for more details. Burning questions. Who wants to come in? Please be brief. Lady at the front.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, all of you. In your presentations, you entertained the consideration...
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, forgive me. Lul Sayoum from the International Center for Eritrean Refugees and Asylum Seekers. And if I may say, Eritrea is producing the highest number of refugees. And in the UK, in 2015, the number of Eritreans refugees is higher than that of the Syrians. But I would like to park that one and come straight to my question. You raised the fact that there is consideration of changing policies, attitudes, and approaching governments. I was wondering how much consideration there is in that refugees themselves should be part of the conversation. It looks as if talking about me without me. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman at the back, and the lady there, and then we'll come for one final comment.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sten. I work with Save the Children as a risk advisor. I have one question. I'm working a bit on the Uganda context, and I have one question, and this is really, don't take it bad. I mean, what I'm going to say is, if we see what happened a little bit in Europe related to refugees, would a successful approach also be vulnerable to criticisms or political reflections that it creates a suction effect, like a successful approach both for the refugees as for the host country, and would that potentially be could there be a backlash? I mean, I hope not, obviously.
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
So if Uganda has a very progressive refugee approach and it allows for access to education, to certain levels of social protection, to employment, to free travel, to travel documents and everything, which is what we laud and what we encourage, would it be possible that due to certain circumstances this would become under a kind of political fire and might backlash and might collapse and might inspire other governments not to go in that direction? It's a question of how you, in my language we say it's like, oh, it's devil's advocate. That's what it, yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. And finally, the lady at the back here.
Thank you. My name is Leila, and I work at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And my question is to Ziad. Since the UNHCR is not only a humanitarian organization, you're also an intergovernmental agency with a lot of legal obligations and legal role. And that role hasn't been done very well in the Syria crisis and along the recent refugee crisis. We have seen very, very little about ensuring safe passages. The whole thing about the refugee crisis across Europe has been a shame. In the few gains that has been done around Syria, including 50,000 work permits that has been almost strictly granted to domestic workers, Syrian female domestic workers who did not want to do that, but that's the only opportunity. And it's being presented as a solution to refugees. And the situation in Turkey where this gentleman agreement that you spoke about, Veronique, has ended up in the heads of organizations that are providing almost all the services to Syrians being detained now in Gaziantep. UNHCR haven't done a lot about this. Don't you think it's time to reconsider all the funds that you're taking from states who think that they're giving this money for the well-being of refugees and giving the space to other international organizations who are actually making a difference with far less resources? Thanks.
I'll let you think about that. Laura, let me come to you to comment on the questions that have been asked in this round and any from the previous round that you also want to add any reflections to.
There's too many notes. I don't even know where to start. I want to mention something about the DAB. I realize I heard what he just said, but thousands of Somalis have been sent, I can't even say back to Somalia because they were born in Kenya. The majority of the students I've taken out of the DAB in their 18, 19, 20 years old, they were born in Dadaab, right? They're born in Kenya. But now and their families have been pushed to Somalia where there's absolutely nothing there for them. There's no infrastructure, no future, nothing. They're being sent with $250 in busloads. I have photos of these buses. It has stopped, but for a long time this was ongoing and it was pretty horrific. I actually lost 3 of my students. It took me months to find them again because their cell phones were taken anyhow. So it's not a pretty situation. I'm glad it's now paused, but it's there's been a lot of damage there, and I hope that things improve with the Somalis that have been pushed to a country that they've never seen, and many have never known. But anyhow, sorry, I'm very passionate about it because I started in Dadaab, and we still have a lot of families there completely affected directly by what's happened in Kenya. I want to go back to the skill gaps. We talk about jobs and integration, and they're taking my job. When I go to any conference, I don't care, and I used to be in finance for 18 years, and every World Bank conference, IDP conference, the big thing you hear is skill gaps. There are tons of skill gaps in all these countries. There's no real matching of skill gaps with what, let's say, the refugee population has. And I know there are some entities trying to do some matchings. I haven't seen like a proper scaling of this, but I think, of course, that kind of sounds obvious to me. When you have government saying we have skill gaps in these industries, and here you have an incredible vast population of refugees sitting idle in many of these countries, why not hire them? And of course, then you go into the work permits and having the proper documentation, which goes into something else that someone asked there about proper documentations and passports and IDs. You don't want undocumented people in your country. Look at what's happening here in the US. I mean, I'm horrified by what this administration is doing. And it's, what you absolutely want are people that have proper documentations, that they feel safe in the country they're in, that they feel there are rights and they're secure and they're safe and they can prosper and do something legally. No one wants to be working illegally. It's just that the environment doesn't support them to do things legally. So you survive. But of course, so proper documentation, proper passports, proper IDs, of course, is the way to go. And again, this skill gap thing is so, it's so obvious. And every meeting I go to, every big conference I go to, all these government people complaining about skill gaps. And here we have this population. So we are speaking to one government in the EU that's approached me to hire our graduates for Link. And I'm talking to the employment agency of this country, of this government. So it's one of the big governments in Europe. And we're delighted. And they've said, Lorna, we have so many skill gaps in these specific skills, and you're training them in tech. Can we find a way? And I said, absolutely. So, this is great that our first client may be a government and a federal employment agency. But this is to me, this is obvious. You have gaps, we can fill them. All we need is to then move resettle. They'll have to be resettled to these countries, or they'll have to go with different work permits. The point is for them to go legally into the work environment and be able to prosper. But connecting that link, I think, is important. And there is, I keep saying it, the want is there from governments and corporations. It's finding each other. I think that is, I'm not going to say a challenge because I'm seeing it happen. I think it's just sort of more of a new conversation we're having, and I'm delighted to see it happen. So I can just hope that more come along. I don't know what other. I mean, I wrote a ton of things about other questions here. The integration piece with the hosting community. So this is big with what we're doing with Link. This is why we're hiring 50% refugees, 50% Jordanians. It wasn't because the Jordanian government told me to do this. It was because we thought it was important. The hosting community has an opportunity to meet refugees, interact with refugees, and get to know each other. Because just because they're in your country doesn't mean you're going to interact with them. And I think once you interact with someone that you don't understand, and you become friends with this person, guess what? You're going to like this person. They're no longer this foreign kind of, they're no longer this alien that's come in and taking things. They're going to be your buddy. They're going to be your friend. And that to me is the peace building aspect of it,
Thank you, Laura. Let me come to Tamam. There were
Yes,
also some questions here.
As a medical provider, I cannot answer your question, Tom, on obviously isn't going to scale. My worry here is that if we say, well, let's experiment by incentivizing a whole country, so maybe they get people to work. First, I don't understand the politics behind it. Is it trying to keep Syrians in Jordan so they wouldn't come to Europe? Or is it actually a genuine effort? Second, what I know for a fact is that money spent on incentivizing Jordan that might or might not work is money not spent on something else. There's an opportunity cost to adventurism in humanitarian. I don't know if he can afford it. The other thing is, Juliet, I wish I could answer you beyond big statements and policy statements. In our experience, it works. You're dealing with one family, and we have dealt sometimes with a few and with many. It works until people become friends. It works with finding a benefit for the community, even if it's not a burden. Just telling people this is not a burden isn't enough. A way of finding benefit to the people who are suffering poverty and want. As well by that program is probably difficult, but it's probably worth it and that's what we do on scale, and it usually works. And one would hope to believe that poor people understand each other and can be in solidarity better than the rich. But Noha, the data is open. In MSF, for example, this is a trend. We have put an data sharing policy that make our data completely open, respecting only the the autonomy, the privacy of our patients. So anyone who is going to use it for a non-profit purpose is welcome to ask for data, and we think everybody should do the same, because this is not our data, this is the patient's data and should be available for others who would. The conditions are for it to benefit them and for it to be not used for profit. Abdi, I don't know if they'll close the DAB or not. What I know is that they have pushed people between the announcing to close it and it not having closed, they've pushed potentially thousands of people to go and seek voluntary repatriation, which means that they didn't kick them by police and guns. They nearly forced them out of Dadaab because they offered them a package of voluntary return. So people thought, if we're going to be kicked out by the police, we might as well go out, and many people did. And I regret that this is not a choice. What is called voluntary repatriation has never been a choice that people were free to make. Alexandra, I want to say something. It scares the hell out of me, because refugees are stigmatized as it is. The shade of their color, the shade of their accent, everything stigmatizes them. To add layers of poverty classification is something that will magnificently backfire. then we become a refugee degree 1 poverty versus a refugee degree 4 poverty, as if they don't have enough stuff to worry about being called it. And I know that, you know, potentially on an economic Excel sheet it looks fine, but in the real world, everything that could stigmatize people does stigmatize people. And I don't know if a poverty analysis, which sounds, you know, it reminds me of Oliver Twist, the word they call him in the restaurant. It was a poverty stigmatization that still exists today in every community, and I don't know if we want to add that. Last couple of words. Sulol, I thank you for speaking out, because, you know, today us Syrians are the flavor of the day. We will be forgotten in a few months or years, just as happened in Eritrea. And unless there is a real solidarity and a real identification with each other, refugees cannot be allowed to segregate and start becoming a problem to each other. And we help with that, because now the donors give us money to go for Syrian refugees, so fine. And the Eritreans are not on CNN. It's partially everybody's responsibility to not allow issues that aren't a CNN event to go away from memory. And the last word to Sten, please don't use the fascists' arguments. It's not even funny when it's a devil's advocate argument. People are dying. It's not a choice they make lightly. If you give them a 1-bedroom apartment in an estate council here, it's not going to flood Europe with refugees. We get quoted on things that we say wrongly. And I really fear that if we start allowing ourselves, and you're not the first one in our sector to say that. Many people say, it's none of my business. I am a humanitarian actor, and I will act in the benefit of people in need wherever they are, whatever they are. We have enough people making those arguments for us to worry about them. I would worry about helping the people we want to serve and not provoking arguments that might be actually harmful, even for the sake, I don't know, even for the sake of
we have to engage
argument.
in those arguments, because
We
they're
have to
live in the
fight
policy
them
debates
rather
out
than-
there.
We have to argue them rather than echo them. But
They're important arguments. We need to close. I just want 1 minute to reply to Leila, the question that she put straight to UNHCR.
Yes, within the 1 minute, let me tackle other issues also, because within the 1 minute on the poverty analysis, tamam, it's always good to identify weaknesses and challenges, but there is no targeting if there is no poverty analysis, and we are all being criticized by beneficiaries, by refugees, by persons of concern for wrongly targeting. So giving the assistance to the right people. In some places, the assistance was given to the wrong people because there is no poverty analysis. So there is a purpose for it. On the Uganda example, I would say a country like Uganda should be supported by the international community and by donors in order to survive its own challenges. And definitely the challenges are not related to the refugees. Uganda has development challenges. Still, they have an open attitude, so they should be supported, Uganda and others also. On the question related, or on the statement related to the fund, you rightly said that UNHCR has a monitoring role for the 51 Convention. And we are issuing our monitoring reports in the governing body structure that we have, which is the standing committee and the executive committee in a regular way. So now it's the standing committee cycle. As we speak, member states come to UNHCR, to the Palais des Nations in Geneva, and we meet with them, and we issue our reports on regional situations, on sectoral situations. And I refer you to the statement of the director of Europe Bureau in the last standing committee a few weeks ago on Europe situation, because you brought up the ensuring safe passages. I was in the standing committee. I was listening to this person, the director of Europe Bureau, and I was even surprised. With all my UN experience, I was surprised that this statement is coming from a UN diplomat. I think we are being as much as we can bold, clear on critics related to the 51 Convention and other issues, but still we are not an authority in the world. We are a monitoring body mandated by the UN General Assembly to issue observations and to give directions, but we can't open ourselves safe passages. I mean, we are. Yeah, I'm coming to the second point, which is the fund that you. So, my first reaction, definitely, we should agree that more funds should be given to others, and this is the whole concept of comprehensive refugee response framework and global compact. The content of it, when it's going to be published, it's going to be about everybody should be responsible because one agency cannot do everything. My second reaction on this point is actually most of the money that we receive from donors is channeled to partners, and we never do things alone. So you might see a lot of even small agencies doing work on the ground that are completely funded by UNHCR in many places, but it's not about funding. So let's just conclude this point. It's not about funding. It's about mandate and roles. UNHCR role sometimes could be given a little bit, could be stretched by activists and some community NGOs because there are very high expectations. So everybody is expecting UNHCR to solve the refugee problem in the world. However, there are mandates and there are capacities, and I think it is even beyond mandate. It's about division of labor. So sometimes we fully support a community activism group to go and say what should be said. And we play our role in the General Assembly and in the Standing Committee and in the Executive Committee. I think we cannot play the role of the activists. It's like activists cannot play our role. So it's a division of labor. It's not about funding, and we definitely fully agree more about more funding.
I think it's fair to say they work better in some countries than in others, and let's hope that the CRRF really opens the space for a stronger collaborations, everywhere. Thank you. You've been patient. I know we've gone over time. This is clearly a live discussion with a lot of interest. For those who are staying, there are wine and nibbles. So for those who are not fasting and drink wine, there is wine and nibbles next door. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panelists. It's been a really interesting, useful, passionate discussion.